Well, hello, folks, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Chris Street, a professor at Cal State Fullerton, and today we're going to be talking about providing helpful feedback to student writers. So here are the goals for the day. We are going to discuss the power of our feedback. We're going to explore why providing quality feedback is so important. We're going to discover several strategies and resources for providing effective feedback to writers. And we're going to talk about some of the issues that you're likely facing as you consider providing quality feedback to in your own classrooms. So I'd like everybody to think about this for a minute. Why is, in your own world as a teacher, why is providing quality feedback such a challenge? And if you could drop your thoughts into the chat. And so let's see what we came up with. One challenge that you think of when you consider providing quality feedback to student writers. And obviously, time is coming up with many of you as I'm looking through your responses. So for sure, time is a big issue. Yeah, a couple people mentioned that they haven't really been trained in how to do this. They didn't have any professional training or any college work or graduate level coursework to really help them with. So some teachers feel a little bit ill-equipped to provide quality feedback. And then, yeah, sometimes the students, yeah, a couple people have mentioned this. You're mentioning that the students' apathy or the students don't really, they're not really they're not really super focused on the quality we're giving them. They're looking at the grade. So yeah, those are common challenges. This is not an easy thing. So what I'd like to do is to set the stage for this session today. I want to share with you a video, and I'll pause the recording just for a minute when we look this over. It's called Austin's Butterfly. It's about 7 minutes long. And in it, I'd like you to think about the process exhibited in the video. And how does the story of Austin's Butterfly connect with your instructional setting? So you're going to see a really heartwarming vignette with some really, really young students who are vibrant and energetic and have a lot of energy. And they're going to be taken through a process of seeing how a piece of art has been transformed over time based on quality feedback. And this process, I think you'll see, has definitely has some relevance for us as teachers of writing. So I'll pause the recording and I will start the video and then we'll pop back in as soon as the video is over. Okay, so like I said, it was pretty cute, wasn't it? So we have lots to think about here to talk about, but I'm hoping you saw the importance of feedback along the way. I hope that you noticed that the quality feedback was kind, it was supportive, and it was also detailed and specific. Those are lessons I think that we can take away from this video. And also, I hope you notice the number of drafts that this piece of art went through and how the initial draft by the student and the final product were radically different. And that was based on quality feedback that was provided. And the artist had the ability to revise and to make changes and to use that feedback to improve. So lots of lessons for us as teachers of writing there. Okay, so I wrote an essay, my first ever publication when I was a teacher on special assignment. I just finished my, I think, fourth year of teaching middle school English. And I took a leave of absence to work on my PhD and wrote this essay, which is very autobiographical. And it's all about who I am as a writer. I like to share this with students first so that they see me as a real working writer. And it also talks about some of the struggles that I went through. So it really helps to bring me down to their level so they see me as a fellow writer and not as some professor who is all knowing and that this is easy for. because it is not. And I too have struggled with writing. So I want you to read through just the highlighted section here in yellow. I'll pause the recording for a minute, give you a second to think about that, and then we'll come back and chat about what we noticed. Okay, so there is one of my early writing experiences, and you can see the kind of feedback I got was at times pretty harsh. And those are lessons I have never forgotten. In fact, what I took away from Mrs. Wall, my English teacher, was not to do what she did. And we can learn a lot from our teachers. Sometimes it's what we would like to emulate, and other times they are things to avoid. So I like to share this with students. I like them to see me as a writer and to see the struggles that I've had as a writer. So I want you to think about what you noticed, what emotions were elicited, what experiences did this cause you to recall? What lessons might we take from this example? And I'll give you a second to think about those things, and then we'll pop some ideas into the chat. Yeah, so some of us, as I see in the chat here, are sharing experiences that were similar to mine. Many were different, but some were similar. And I want you to think about, and we'll just do this as a thinking exercise rather than a quick write, but what do you recall from your days as a student writer? So put yourself in the position of your writers in your class. And maybe you can go back to that age when you were that age. And what do you recall? What pops into your mind when you were a student writer? So in the chat, I see people already sharing their ideas. Thank you very much. And those are definitely worth remembering, because what we recall as student writers, it helps to ground us in the lived experiences of what our students are experiencing when we are teaching writing to them. And so it's a valuable thought exercise to put ourselves in the position of our writers, of our student writers, and think back to what kind of support that you received as a student writer or perhaps didn't receive. And especially in terms of feedback, lots of people in the chat are mentioning the kind of supportive feedback they received or the kind of overly critical, unhelpful feedback. And some of you are mentioning you don't remember any feedback, and that too is telling. So, as a group, what memories do we have from our days as student writers? What impact have they had on our lives? And as people shared, these are lasting memories. And oftentimes, as you saw in my essay, the kind of feedback we receive from teachers has a great deal of power. And oftentimes that feedback lasts for the rest of our lives. We don't forget it. I won't forget the kind of critical feedback I described in my essay ever. So my approach is to see myself as a writing mentor. I really like this idea of developing a writing or a mentoring stance. So the ERWC curriculum, which I'll reference throughout my presentation, it's a high school English course and curriculum that a lot of you, I'm sure, are comfortable with and know about, but for others, it might be new. That curriculum really focuses on establishing a sense of trust, safety, and mutual respect between teachers and students before transformative teaching and learning is possible. So taking the time to establish that trusting, that safe, that mutual respect in the classroom is important before we can really make inroads as teachers. That's a nice reminder. And meaningful teaching and learning really only begins when the grade fever subsides and a student begins to view the teacher's response as a dialogue, a communication process. So getting away from just grades and trying to focus more on the communication process, the dialogue, the feedback as a process, so that we are seen as supportive coaches, as mentors, rather than as overly critical graders of student work. Positive, encouraging coaching tone allows students to see us as partners in their development as writers. And finally, unless students benefit from the comments we provide, they're likely to view those comments as judgments rather than opportunities to expand their knowledge and skills. So we really need to put time into the kind of comments that we're putting on student work, the tone we're using, because they need to see benefit in our feedback. Otherwise, they won't generally benefit much from it. So here's a practical takeaway, a paper that I wrote with a few colleagues that talks a lot more about this mentoring approach. If you'd like to, you can click on the link, and this is something that I like to do in the first couple of days of school. Hand something like this to my students, and so that they can look through this. This is kind of like my contract to them. I will provide you with this mentoring approach to writing, and here's some values that I hold firm. And it's almost like a contract where students can now see me as a colleague and somebody who's there to provide them with support. I will give them this level of support, and this or something similar to this is something you might consider sharing with students. What is your philosophy as a teacher of writing? And if you were to share this and talk about it as a class, it might help to get everybody on the same page. And also it might help to reduce stress and might help to bring everybody together around these common aspects that everybody agrees to regarding writing. So something like that could be helpful to you. And then we can obviously, you can adapt this, right? So I would encourage you to not just take something like this and use it, but think about it and how would you change it and create your own based on your own best practices and your own philosophy on how you'd like to approach providing students with written feedback. If you want to read more, the full paper that this comes from is available here. This is on the ERWC website. So this is how you find it. And it's the top one here called Adopting a Mentoring Stance. Okay, so the ARC, this is another ERWC specific resource that I think is worthy of sharing. You don't need to be an ERWC teacher to benefit from this. What it really does is help conceptualize this instructional arc. So think about the far left-hand side of this arc. This is where we're introducing students to professional text. Whatever they're reading is written by a professional. It might be a novel, poem, a short story, an article, a web page, whatever it was prepared by a professional. So we help students prepare for that reading. We guide them through an understanding of the reading. We help them ask thoughtful questions of that reading so that they are then well positioned in the middle of that arc to flip over and take a stance. And now they're ready to enter that conversation and they're ready to respond to that reading. They're ready to write their own text and they're ready to revise it at the end. So we're supporting texts, or we're supporting students all the way from reading professional text all the way through to then using that professional text to help them make their own argument in their student-generated text. Every module goes from this professional text with support until students can then understand that text well enough, see the tools of the trade that are being used by this professional author, and hopefully emulate some of them when they generate their own student text. So when we're thinking about assessing and responding to student writing, it's important to think about if all the feedback that we provide, does it make a difference? I've asked myself that question many times. So has Stephen Graham and his colleagues. They have put together this report called The Benefits of Formative Assessment. And it is a free PDF. You can get to it here by clicking on the icon or the image of the resource. It will take you to the free PDF. He was asking two questions. Does formative writing assessment enhance student writing? So does the feedback that students receive while they're writing in the drafting phase help them in their writing? And secondly, how can teachers improve formative writing assessment in the classroom? So here's what he came up with. He found a strong and consistent relationship between teacher feedback and improved student writing. When we give them good feedback and they have the opportunity to use that feedback to revise, their writing improves. So our feedback really does matter. And he looked at hundreds of studies, and these are the results that are all the research was very, very clear on this. There really wasn't any ambiguity. Good feedback leads to improved writing. So he also had some recommendations for teachers on how to provide effective feedback. So this is a link to the best practices, the feedback recommendations that he came up with, but some of them are here. And some of them are things we may or may not have thought of before. Mask the students' identities when reading. So student, for example, maybe uses their student ID number rather than their name on the paper so that when we're reading, we don't know who the students are. That can make a difference. Form a question about the content. I like this one because when you are, as a reader, asking questions in the margins of the writer, it's not threatening and it's an engaging dialogue. It's a communication channel that students may not have experienced from a writing teacher before. And note something you think is a good idea. So if there are positive things that you're noticing, point those out because far too often students tend to see our feedback as being pretty critical. And if we can also point out the things they're doing well, it helps them see us as mentors who are providing helpful support as opposed to overly critical reviewers who are just there to give a grade. So when students see us as more experienced guides who are there to help them improve, they tend to be more receptive to working hard for us. So the tone we take really, really matters. Positive coaching tone is what I really like. All right, here's one that students probably don't want to see, do they? Rewriting is the essence of writing well. It's where the game is won or lost. And this is from William Zinsser. We'll talk about his book in the next few slides. I like this one. I believe in this one. This is where professional writers often spend the majority of their time revising what they have created rather than just drafting. But students, many of them, they just want to get it done and turn it in. So we need to help them see the value of revision. This comes from On Writing Well. It's been around for well over 30 years now. It's the best book I know on writing. I use it in my graduate level writing course that I teach in the summers. It's funny, it's engaging, it's written by a real pro. William Zinsser was a writing teacher at Yale, and he was also a writer. And he wrote books, he wrote articles, and his thing was, how do you grab the reader's attention and hold on to it? And his lessons, his guide to writing nonfiction, they are timeless. And I think if you were to invest the tiny amount of money it would take to get a used copy of this, it'd be well worth your time. So On Writing Well by William Zinsser, the best book I know on writing. Here's another really good one. They Say, I Say. Weird title. I'll talk about it in a minute, but this book can help. And if you don't have this book, and you don't want to buy it, you don't necessarily need to, because at the end of the book, in the appendices, are a series of templates or sentence frames. And you can find them online. Every university and college in the country has a writing center to support their students. And every single one of those that I've ever checked supports the use of these They Say, I Say templates. So they oftentimes have them on their college writing center websites. There are so many out there. I'm just going to show one to you. So this is an example of an index of templates that's available at the end of the book. And you can see there are templates or sentence frames for all kinds of things, all kinds of moves that academic writers need to make that they probably don't know how to make unless they've had a whole lot of practice and support. So here's a common one, introducing quotations. I'm sure your students struggle with how to integrate a quote into the body of their own writing. Here are some templates that students could use or adapt or ignore if they're comfortable with this already. But it gives them some frames, some ways to introduce a quotation. And then equally important is how do you then explain the quotation after the quote has been introduced? How do you help the reader understand why that quote is significant? Here are some frames or sentence starters for doing that. So you can see as I pull down here, there are dozens and dozens of sentence frames or templates to support students with the complex writing that we ask them to do when we ask them to engage in academic writing. So this can be a really, really helpful resource, one for students so that they have a better sense of how to do the kind of academic writing we're asking of them. And secondly, for me as a writing teacher, I oftentimes will suggest a template in a very specific place within student writing for a particular purpose to help them get out of a problem area. So these can be helpful to me or to you as well as a writing teacher in order to provide students with a kind of specific, concise, detailed feedback that we saw in Austin's Butterfly and that we know from Graham's work is really helpful to helping student writers improve. So if you were to Google the phrase, they say, I say templates, you're going to find lots of resources like the one I shared with you above. So you don't necessarily need the book to get the templates at the end. If you want the book though, and it's a great resource, the reason it has this title is because it's asking students to enter a conversation. So first, before they enter this conversation in writing, they need to understand what others are saying, the they say part. So it helps them summarize, paraphrase, quote directly, all the ways in which we need to summarize what others are saying, what they say, before we're ready to set up our own argument, which is the I say part of the title. So they say the book is half about helping us understand and summarize well what others are saying so that we can then enter the conversation, set up our own argument, and engage in writing ourselves, the I say portion. It's really all about demystifying academic writing and showing students the moves that matter. And it provides those user-friendly templates to help writers make those moves in their own writing. So again, here's a few more examples, giving students some possibilities for how to paraphrase something. We ask students to paraphrase, but oftentimes they're not quite sure how or what we mean. These templates could be helpful. And they aren't overly simplistic. I don't think that they are reductionistic. I think instead they're helpful heuristics, they're helpful learning tools. For example, Howard Gardner, professor at Harvard, he asks his postdoctoral fellowship applicants to complete the following template. Most scholars in the field believe blank. As a result of my study, blank. So think about that for a minute. If you're going into this research environment and you're proposing an area of research, if you are able to complete this template, it's going to show Howard Gardner a whole lot about your knowledge of what others they say and what you intend to say. So this is a nice frame for some really, really deep scholarly thinking that can come out when using a template like this. So oftentimes though, students when we ask them to write for us and we're asking them to write something for an outside audience or a longer piece, like a more formal piece of writing, they may have questions about exactly what they're asked to do. So considering the writing task is helpful. It's really important that they know what it is that we want them to do. So take a second to read this prompt. Yeah, and it's not going to be easy, is it? This is a challenging prompt. It comes from one of the modules in ERWC at the 12th grade level called juvenile justice. So this would be something that seniors would be responding to. So would your students struggle with this? I would bet they would. Here's something that might help. It's called the do what chart. There's a video here that links to a teacher explaining to her 12th graders how to do a do what chart. But I'm going to skip the video because of time. You can certainly go back and watch it if you like. So what you do with the do what chart is, and I would demonstrate this for students myself as a teacher the first time, you find the verbs in the prompt and you write them on the do side. And then on the other side of the chart, you figure out what it is that that verb is asking us to do. So for example, the first verb we see in this prompt is to write. What are we writing? An essay. We're asked to analyze. What are we analyzing? The issues. We're indicating. What are we indicating? What side you're on. Supporting. What are we supporting? The position that we take. And then the last verb is provide. What are we providing? Reasons and examples. Here's what it looks like. So here's the prompt. Here are the verbs. And you can see here that something like this helps students, draws attention to the actual task that they are asked to respond to. So something like a do what chart could be worth your while, especially if your students are asked to do something like this, where it's very complex and there's a lot happening in this prompt. It might help them understand it. Another good book I like called Papers, Papers, Papers by Carol Jago. It's been around a while. It's an English teacher survival guide. So she's been teaching. If you don't know Carol Jago, she has been a teacher of English probably 35 years. She was the former president of the National Council of Teachers of English, written all kinds of books, articles. She's a phenom in the field. I'm going to share with you some of her suggestions. So she says in her book, the most successful comments or corrections are those referring specifically to criteria that teachers had taught in class. So for example, if you had done in class a mini lesson on active verbs and passive verbs, and you were wanting your students to use active verb constructions, if you're focusing your comment around that area of verbs, they're generally going to be helpful comments because students have had that lesson and it was taught in class. And so they have that as a reference point. She also says students resent extensive criticism and generally ignore more than a few well-placed, focused, and easily understood suggested changes in writing style or substance. So you as a professional, you as an educator may see 20 or 30 things in the writing that needs to be worked on. She would suggest, I think, maybe a few well-placed, focused, and easily understood comments are going to help students rather than overwhelm them. So we may see a lot more than we comment on in a piece of student writing. And Carol would, I think, say that that's okay. She also says, don't rewrite the student paper. Focus on key areas for improvement. Use the student's name in your comments. Separate your response to content from your comments on mechanical errors. And she does a great job of responding as a reader. She asks questions, lots of questions that she asks in the margin to guide students toward where she wants them to go. Some other tips, she says, do it now. Comment, don't correct. That's a hard thing. I have a very hard time with this, making comments rather than correcting as I read. Set aside extended periods of time for grading, no interruptions. Use a timer. Investigate computer scoring. She says computer scoring, though not a substitute for an effective teacher, maybe you do this once or twice throughout the year to give yourself a little bit of break and give students a different kind of feedback. Use a rubric. Make sure students read your comments and save student papers so you have models for students when you next teach this assignment. You can't teach what you don't know any more than you can come back from where you ain't been, says Will Rogers. So when we ask kids in peer groups to provide self-assessment, peer reviews, they need help with that. And we need to structure that for students. Otherwise, they probably won't be very effective. So she says, Carol does, those struggling writers are rarely able to help one another with editing. They can offer powerful feedback, particularly when the response is oral rather than written on another student's paper. And if a draft is not communicating clearly to a peer, it's unlikely to be a satisfactory product for a wider audience. So here are some self-assessment questions. She thinks that student writers are able to help one another with the following basic questions. Does it make sense? Can you follow my argument? Where did you get lost? What do you need to know or want to know that I haven't told you? So students are just having a conversation. They're not even writing things down. And they can talk about these points and help one another sharpen their writing. She has all kinds of suggestions for how to stay sane as a teacher while giving good feedback. So she really believes, as do I, that feedback before the final version is due is the time for us to offer our feedback. And lots of ways to do that. What's the best thing about this draft? What is the biggest overall difficulty with the draft? How could this draft be improved? Just those three questions are an example of minimal marking. So you can do this quickly as a teacher, and it's minimal marking, but she says sometimes this is the best we can do due to the number of students we have, and it still provides students with a sense of direction. They know we've read their work, and we're again responding as a mentor. So teaching writing well involves lots of things, and one of them is, how do we deal with the paper load? So I want you to think about some ideas that you as a teacher find helpful when you are thinking about handling the paper load and writing well. I'll pause for a minute, give you a chance to think about that. And I'd like you each to think of three must share ideas from your list of what you as a teacher do that's working for you. And then we'll share some of those out loud when we come back. Okay, great suggestions. This one was, a couple of you mentioned similar things. I like this example of the hamburger approach where you, and the two buns, you're giving positive feedback. And then in the middle is where you're providing constructive criticism. So students, our feedback opens with a positive. We give them their direction in the middle for what they can do to improve. And then we end with something positive. So this can make a big difference to students because oftentimes we need to help them see what they're doing well as what they need to improve upon. So finally, I know many of you mentioned some of the digital tools you're using, and some of them are mentioned here or highlighted here on this screen. These are some of the tools that you can use to give feedback, even if you're not sitting in front of the students with whom you're working. Lots of electronic ways to capture your voice, to share your screen, to create screen share videos. These are all free, or at least most of them are. So I want to get a sense of the ones that you find helpful and give you a minute to suggest any additional tools that you like that we can talk about that can be helpful for teaching writing, for providing feedback, and for managing the paper load in a digital setting. So I'll again pause for a second and give people a chance to share in the chat some of the other tools they find helpful. Okay, thanks for all the sharing that occurred. So finally, now we're going to wrap it up with some Q&A time. So if you have any questions about responding to student papers or adopting a mentoring stance, we'll have a few minutes to chat about that. All right, so hope that wasn't too bad. And I very much appreciate everybody being here today. You're certainly free to use any part of this presentation as long as you're not making money from it and you're giving credit where credit is due. So thank you again, everybody. I hope you gain something practical that you can use from this webinar, and I very much appreciate you being here today.